Imagine discovering that the heart of your business is a man living in a trailer behind the store, working tirelessly to help others, while two employees plot his downfall. John Bilson, owner of Café Harmony, decided to go undercover to uncover the truth. What he found would change not only his business but his life. Café Harmony was one of the most popular spots in the small town of Havenbrook. Known for its cozy atmosphere and artisanal coffee, it was part of a growing chain owned by John Bilson, a self-made entrepreneur who had built his business from the ground up. But lately, something had been off. Sales at the Havenbrook location were declining, and customer reviews, while still positive, had started to mention a lack of warmth and consistency in service. John, a hands-on owner despite his busy schedule, decided it was time to see for himself what was going on. John adjusted the worn baseball cap he had borrowed from his nephew, pulling it low over his eyes. He wore a simple flannel shirt, jeans, and a pair of scuffed boots. Nothing like the tailored suits he usually wore to board meetings. He wanted to blend in, to see his cafe through the eyes of a regular customer. As he pushed open the door to Café Harmony, the familiar chime of the bell above the door greeted him, but no one behind the counter looked up. Perfect. His disguise was working. The cafe was bustling with the morning rush. Baristas moved quickly behind the counter, steaming milk and calling out orders. Customers filled the small tables, some typing on laptops, others chatting over cups of coffee. John took a seat at a corner table, where he could observe the entire operation without drawing attention. He ordered a black coffee and a croissant, paying in cash to avoid any chance of being recognized. As he sipped his coffee, John noticed something that made him pause. Two baristas, a young woman with a high ponytail and a guy with a cocky grin, were whispering near the espresso machine. Their name tags read Lisa and Ryan. They were laughing, but there was something off about their demeanor. John strained to hear their conversation over the noise of the cafe. "Did you see George this morning?" Lisa said, rolling her eyes. "He's moving slower than ever. I don't know why they keep him around." Ryan smirked. "Yeah, he's like a relic. Should have retired years ago. But hey, at least he's good for cleaning up our messes, right?" John's jaw tightened. He scanned the cafe and spotted George, an elderly man with a slight hunch, quietly wiping down tables and refilling sugar jars. George moved with deliberate care, his hands steady despite his age. He didn't seem to notice the barista's comments, or if he did, he chose to ignore them. John's curiosity was piqued. He had heard of George during his occasional visits to the cafe, but he had never paid much attention to the older man. Now he couldn't help but watch him closely. George didn't just clean. He interacted with customers in a way that seemed almost second nature. He greeted regulars by name, asked about their families, and even helped a young mother carry her stroller to the door. It was clear that George was more than just a janitor. He was the heart of the cafe, even if no one seemed to notice. But as the morning went on, John began to notice other things. Lisa and Ryan were careless with their work, often leaving spills unattended and rushing through orders. They seemed more interested in chatting with each other than serving customers. And then there was the way they treated George. Every time he passed by, they exchanged smirks or made snide comments under their breath. John felt a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. As he finished his coffee, John overheard another snippet of conversation between Lisa and Ryan. "We need to do something about George," Lisa said, her voice low but sharp. "He's always in the way, and he's making us look bad." Ryan nodded. "Yeah, he's always playing the hero. It's annoying." John's stomach churned. He had built Café Harmony on the idea of community and kindness, but what he was witnessing was the opposite. He needed to know more. What was really going on in his cafe? And why was George, a man who clearly cared about the place, being treated so poorly? As John left the cafe, he made a silent promise to himself. He would return not as the owner but as the undercover customer. He would uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. And if what he suspected was true, he would make sure that justice was served not just for George, but for everyone who believed in the values Café Harmony was supposed to stand for. John returned to Café Harmony the next day, dressed in the same unassuming clothes as before. He arrived early, just as the cafe was opening, and took a seat at the same corner table. This time, he ordered a simple tea and a muffin, keeping his head down as he observed the morning routine. The cafe was quieter at this hour, with only a handful of customers scattered around the room. George was already there, moving methodically through his tasks. John watched as the older man wiped down tables, refilled condiment stations, and swept the floor with a quiet efficiency. Despite his age, George worked with a sense of purpose, his movements steady and deliberate. As the morning progressed, John noticed something he hadn't seen the day before. George wasn't just cleaning, he was helping. When a customer spilled their coffee, George was there in an instant with a mop and a reassuring smile. When a young girl dropped her stuffed animal, George picked it up, dusted it off, and handed it back with a kind word. And when an elderly man struggled to carry his tray to a table, George was there to assist, guiding him gently to his seat. John was struck by George's quiet dignity. The man didn't seek recognition or praise. He simply did what needed to be done. But as John continued to observe, he also noticed the toll the work was taking on George. The older man would occasionally pause to rub his lower back or flex his hands, as if trying to ease the ache of arthritis. Yet he never complained. He just kept working, his face a mask of quiet determination. Around mid-morning, John decided to strike up a conversation with George. He approached the older man as he was wiping down a table near the window. "Excuse me," John said, keeping his voice casual. "I couldn't help but notice how hard you work. How long have you been here?" George looked up, his eyes warm but tired. "Oh, about 7 years now," he said, his voice soft but steady. "It's a good place. I like being useful." John nodded, pretending to be just another curious customer. "You seem to know everyone here. Do you live nearby?" George hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Not too far. Just a little place out back. It's convenient." John's curiosity deepened. "Out back? You mean behind the cafe?" George nodded, but before he could say more, Lisa's voice cut through the air. "George, we need more napkins up here. Stop chatting and get to work." George's expression tightened, but he simply nodded and turned to fetch the napkins. John watched him go, a knot forming in his stomach. There was something about the way Lisa had spoken to George, sharp, dismissive, almost cruel, that didn't sit right with him. As the day went on, John continued to observe George, piecing together the older man's story. He noticed how George would sometimes skip his breaks, staying late to finish his tasks or help a coworker. He saw how customers would greet George by name, their faces lighting up with genuine affection. And he saw how George would quietly slip money into the register when a customer couldn't pay, never asking for anything in return. But John also saw the darker side of George's life. During a lull in the afternoon, he overheard Lisa and Ryan talking near the counter. "Did you see George helping that guy earlier?" Ryan said, his tone mocking. "What a loser. Like anyone cares." Lisa snorted. "Yeah. And did you notice how he's always sneaking money into the register? Like he's some kind of saint. It's pathetic." John's hands clenched into fists under the table. He wanted to confront them, to demand they show some respect, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to see this through to understand the full extent of what was happening. Later, as the cafe began to wind down for the evening, John decided to follow George. He waited until the older man had clocked out and left through the back door, then slipped out after him. George walked slowly, his steps heavy with fatigue, toward a small, dilapidated trailer parked behind the cafe. The trailer was old and rusted, with a tarp covering part of the roof. A single light flickered on inside as George climbed the rickety steps and disappeared through the door. John stood in the shadows, his heart aching. He had built Café Harmony to be a place of warmth and community, but here was one of his most dedicated employees, living in conditions that were anything but warm. He thought about George's quiet kindness, his unwavering dedication, and the way he had been treated by Lisa and Ryan. It was clear that George was the hidden hero of the cafe, a man who gave everything he had without expecting anything in return. As John walked back to his car, he made a silent promise. He would uncover the truth about what was happening in his cafe, and he would make sure that George, and everyone like him, was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. John returned to Café Harmony the next morning, his mind racing with what he had witnessed the day before. He couldn't shake the image of George's trailer or the way Lisa and Ryan had spoken about him. There was more going on in his cafe than he had realized, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. This time, John arrived just as the cafe was opening. He took his usual seat in the corner, ordering a coffee and a pastry, but his attention was focused entirely on the interactions behind the counter. Lisa and Ryan were there again, their laughter loud and grating as they prepared for the morning rush. George was in the back, quietly organizing supplies, his movements slower than usual, as if the previous day's work had taken a toll on him. As the morning progressed, John noticed something that made his blood boil. Lisa and Ryan were deliberately creating chaos. They would spill milk and leave it for George to clean up, or they would accidentally drop dishes near his station, forcing him to stop what he was doing and pick up the mess. Each time, they would exchange smirks, clearly enjoying themselves. But George never complained. He simply cleaned up the spills, picked up the mess, and continued with his work. John could see the strain on the older man's face, but George never let it show. He just kept moving, his quiet dignity intact. Around mid-morning, John witnessed something that confirmed his worst suspicions. A young mother with 2 small children came in, her face drawn with exhaustion. She ordered a small meal, but when she went to pay, her card was declined. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she fumbled through her wallet, trying to find enough cash. "I'm so sorry," she said to Lisa, her voice trembling. "I thought I had enough. Can I maybe come back later to pay?" Lisa's smile was cold. "Sorry, we can't do that. You should have checked your balance before ordering." The woman looked like she was about to cry, her children tugging at her sleeves, unaware of what was happening. Just then, George appeared at the counter. He had been watching from the dishwashing station, and without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. "Here," he said softly, handing the money to Lisa. "This should cover it." Lisa rolled her eyes but took the money, ringing up the order. The woman looked at George with tears in her eyes. "Thank you so much. I'll pay you back, I promise." George shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Just take care of those little ones." As the woman left, Lisa turned to Ryan, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh look, St. George strikes again. What a hero." Ryan laughed. "Yeah, maybe he should start a charity. George's Fund for Deadbeats." John's hands clenched around his coffee cup. He had seen enough. It was clear that Lisa and Ryan were not just cruel. They were actively undermining George, making his job harder and mocking his kindness. But there was more to it than that. John had a sinking feeling that their behavior was part of a larger plan. Later that afternoon, John overheard a conversation that confirmed his suspicions. Lisa and Ryan were huddled near the register, their voices low but audible. "So, did you talk to your cousin?" Lisa asked. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, he's ready to start whenever we need him. He's young, fast, and he'll do whatever we say. No questions asked." Lisa smirked. "Perfect. Once we get rid of George, we can bring him in. And with the referral bonus, we'll both be sitting pretty." Ryan's grin widened. "Yeah, and no more of Grandpa George's heroics. It's getting old." John's stomach turned. They weren't just mocking George. They were planning to get him fired so they could replace him with someone who would do their bidding. And from the sound of it, they were willing to go to great lengths to make it happen. As the day wore on, John continued to observe, his anger growing with each passing hour. He saw Lisa and Ryan deliberately miscounting the cash in the register, pocketing small amounts and then blaming the discrepancies on George. He saw them whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward George with malicious intent. And he saw how George, unaware of their plot, continued to work tirelessly, his kindness undiminished by their cruelty. By the time John left the cafe that evening, he had a plan. He would need evidence, solid, undeniable proof of what Lisa and Ryan were doing. And he would need to act quickly before they could carry out their scheme. As he drove home, John thought about George, the man who had given so much to the cafe, who had touched so many lives with his quiet acts of kindness. He thought about the trailer behind the cafe, the long hours George worked, and the pain he endured without complaint. And he thought about the values he had built his business on, values that Lisa and Ryan had betrayed. John knew what he had to do. He would expose the truth no matter how painful it might be. John arrived at Café Harmony early the next morning, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and determination. He had spent the previous night setting up hidden cameras in key areas of the cafe, determined to catch Lisa and Ryan in the act. He knew he needed irrefutable evidence to expose their scheme and protect George. As the cafe opened, John took his usual seat in the corner, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He ordered a coffee and pretended to read a newspaper, but his attention was fixed on the interactions behind the counter. Lisa and Ryan were already there, their laughter loud and grating as they prepared for the morning rush. George was in the back, quietly organizing supplies, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The morning passed in a blur of activity. John watched as Lisa and Ryan continued their cruel behavior, deliberately creating messes for George to clean up and mocking him under their breath. But today, John noticed something different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. Around mid-morning, John's patience was rewarded. Lisa and Ryan huddled near the register, their voices low but audible. "Okay, today's the day," Lisa said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "We'll make sure the register comes up short, and then we'll point the finger at George. Brianna will have no choice but to fire him." Ryan nodded, a smirk playing on his lips. "Yeah, and once he's gone, we'll bring in my cousin. No more of Grandpa George's heroics." John's stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to see this through, to gather the evidence that would expose their scheme. As the day wore on, John watched as Lisa and Ryan put their plan into action. They deliberately miscounted the cash in the register, pocketing small amounts and then blaming the discrepancies on George. They whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward George with malicious intent. And they made sure to create situations where George would be near the register, setting him up to take the fall. Finally, around mid-afternoon, the moment John had been waiting for arrived. Brianna, the cafe's manager, emerged from her office with a concerned expression. "The numbers aren't adding up," she announced, her voice carrying through the cafe. "We're short almost $100 this week alone." Lisa immediately stepped forward, her face a mask of fake concern. "You know, I've noticed some weird activity around the registers lately. Maybe we should check the security cameras." Brianna frowned. "They've been broken for months. The owner won't approve the budget for new ones." John's heart skipped a beat. This was his moment. He stood up from his seat, removing his baseball cap and revealing his identity. "Actually," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "the cameras have been fixed, and I think it's time we all saw what's really been happening here." The cafe fell silent as John walked to the counter, his presence commanding attention. He connected his phone to the cafe's television, and the screen flickered to life, showing crystal-clear footage from the hidden cameras. The first clip showed Lisa deliberately miscounting the cash in the register, pocketing small amounts and then blaming the discrepancies on George. The next clip showed Ryan creating messes for George to clean up, his laughter cruel and mocking. And then came the final clip. Lisa and Ryan huddled near the register, plotting to get George fired so they could bring in Ryan's cousin. The cafe erupted in gasps and murmurs as the footage played. Brianna's face turned pale, and Lisa and Ryan looked like they had been struck by lightning. "This is the real reason the register has been coming up short," John said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Not because of George, but because of these two." Lisa and Ryan tried to protest, but their words fell on deaf ears. The evidence was undeniable. John turned to Brianna, his expression grim. "I want them out of here, now." Brianna nodded, her face a mixture of shock and anger. "Consider it done." As Lisa and Ryan were escorted out of the cafe, their faces pale and their heads hung in shame, John turned to George. The older man stood quietly by the dishwashing station, his expression a mixture of confusion and relief. "George," John said, his voice softening, "I owe you an apology for failing to ensure you were treated with the respect you deserve." George looked up at John, his eyes clear and steady. "No apology needed, Mr. Bilson. You didn't know." "That's no excuse," John replied, his voice firm. "But I promise you this, everyone will know now. Everyone will know exactly what kind of man George Lawson is." Several customers stood up and went to greet George and John. The elderly man, who had spent years working in the shadows, was finally being recognized for who he was. As the police arrived to take Lisa and Ryan away, John felt a sense of relief wash over him. Justice had been served, but he knew this was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done to ensure that Café Harmony lived up to the values it was supposed to stand for. The morning after the dramatic confrontation, Café Harmony opened its doors as usual, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Word had spread quickly through the small town of Havenbrook about what had happened, and curious customers filled every booth and counter seat. But they weren't just there for the gossip. They had come to show their support for George. John arrived early, dressed in a simple button-down shirt rather than his usual business attire. He wanted to make it clear that things would be different from now on, that he wasn't just an absentee owner but a present and engaged leader. He greeted the staff with a warm smile, his presence reassuring and steady. George arrived precisely on time, as always, though he looked slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. Customers greeted him by name, offering smiles and words of encouragement. The elderly man nodded politely to each person, clearly overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. "George," John called, gesturing toward his office. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The cafe fell quiet as George made his way across the room. Everyone knew this conversation would determine his future. Inside the small office, John gestured for George to take a seat. The older man sat with quiet dignity, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "George," John began, his voice sincere, "I spent last night thinking about everything I've learned this week, about your situation, your character, and most importantly, about how my own business has strayed from its founding principles." George looked at John, his expression calm but curious. "You've been working as a dishwasher for 7 years?" John continued. "Often doing the work of 2 people, staying late without complaint, and showing more dedication than employees half your age. You've been the heart of this cafe, even if no one noticed." John slid a folder across the desk. "This isn't just a thank you, George. It's an acknowledgement of your value to this company." George opened the folder, his eyes widening as he read the contents. "I don't understand," he said softly. "It's simple," John explained. "Effective immediately, you're being promoted to floor manager. The position comes with a substantial salary increase, full benefits, and more reasonable hours. The physical demands will be less taxing on your health." George stared at the papers in disbelief. "But I don't have management experience." John smiled warmly. "You have something far more valuable: integrity and compassion. You understand what Café Harmony should be about better than anyone. The technical aspects can be learned." Before George could respond, John pushed a second folder forward. "There's something else. I took the liberty of speaking with your daughter in Seattle last night." George looked up sharply. "You called Sarah? She doesn't know about my situation." "She knows everything now," John said gently. "About the trailer, the medical bills, all of it. She was heartbroken that you've been struggling alone all these years." Tears welled in George's eyes. "I never wanted to burden her." "She said you'd say that," John replied with a smile. "She also said to tell you that love isn't a burden. It's a privilege." John tapped the second folder. "Inside, you'll find the deed to a small apartment 3 blocks from here. It's nothing fancy, but it's comfortable, close to work, and most importantly, it's yours. No rent, no mortgage. Consider it 7 years of overdue bonuses." George's hands trembled as he opened the folder and saw the deed with his name on it. "Mr. Bilson, I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's not enough," John countered firmly. I also made arrangements with the hospital. Your wife's remaining medical bills have been paid in full." At this, George's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his lined face as years of struggle and quiet dignity gave way to overwhelming gratitude. "Why would you do this for me?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. John's own eyes misted over. "Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that a business isn't just about profit margins and expansion. It's about people. Every day you've been living the values I only talked about." John stood and extended his hand. "So thank you, George. Not just for your years of service, but for showing me how to be better, as a business owner and as a human being." When they left the office, the entire cafe looked at them in admiration. Brianna stood near the counter, her smile genuine. The staff gathered around, eager to congratulate George on his promotion. John raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "There's one more thing," he announced. "Starting today, Café Harmony is implementing a new company-wide policy. All employees will receive living wages, comprehensive benefits, and emergency assistance when needed. No one who works for this company should ever have to choose between paying bills and helping others." In the weeks that followed, George settled into both his new home and his new position. Though he no longer needed to work much as before, he stayed on not from necessity but from choice. The cafe had become more than a workplace. It was his community, his purpose, his family. Every day, when George walked through the doors of Café Harmony, he was greeted not as the struggling dishwasher living in a rundown trailer, but as the man whose compassion had transformed not just his own life, but an entire business and the community it served. John kept his promise, remaining hands-on in his business. The changes he implemented spread across all his locations, creating a company culture where kindness was valued as highly as profit. And as for Lisa and Ryan, their names became cautionary tales in the industry, a reminder that character matters more than cleverness, and that true worth isn't measured by what you take, but by what you give when you think no one is watching. The story of George and Café Harmony reminds us that the true value of a business isn't in its profits, but in the people who make it work. Kindness and integrity can transform lives and communities. If you believe in the power of small actions to create big changes, subscribe to Embrace the Journey. Here, we explore stories that inspire, teach, and make us reflect on what truly matters.